Throughout this week, as House Democrats, we have engaged in a process of talking to each other. Those conversations have been candid, comprehensive, and clear-eyed, and they continue. Until that process has concluded, I'm not going to address what any outside stakeholders may have to say about this matter.
Turmoil continues inside the Democratic Party after leaders met today to discuss the future of President Biden's candidacy. Meanwhile, Biden is set for a high-stakes press conference tonight in Washington. Biden will take questions from the press as he closes the 75th anniversary NATO summit. White House correspondent Alex Gangitano joins us to discuss. Alex, these press conferences have been a rarity during the Biden presidency, and this one could have a big impact on his reelection campaign.
That's right. This is a really high stakes moment for the president. And you mentioned the rarity of these. The president hasn't had a solo press conference, just him alone after one of these big international summits like what's going on right now since November 2023, when he was in San Francisco for the APEC summit. So this is a big moment. Reporters are waiting to see, things like how many questions he takes from reporters, if he pushes back on questions about, his mental stamina and wants to focus on questions like NATO, or how long he can go for. Will this be a 25-minute press conference, which what we saw in November, or will this be, a 45-minute or an hour that he's trying to prove that he's up for the job? So this is definitely a huge moment. And I think it's not only the media that wants to see how he does, but a lot of lawmakers on the Hill and a lot of his, allies, Democratic operatives, former Democratic politicians, they're all eager to see how he does tonight.
Yeah, and top officials with the Biden campaign on Capitol Hill today, meeting with Senate Democrats, aiming to ease those concerns about Biden's ability to win in November. The meeting comes as the first sitting Democratic U.S. Senator has come forward urging Biden to step aside.
That's right. We saw Senator Peter Welch of Vermont come out and call for him to step aside. That's huge that a senator is now coming, and it could open the floodgates for more senators to come around and want to call for him to step aside. This effort for the Biden team to go to the Hill and want to talk to senators is definitely a sign that they're hearing concerns. They know that more people are going to want to air them publicly, and they're trying to stop that. But when talking to sources about these kinds of meetings, a lot of people have said, why isn't it just Biden going up and trying to prove himself, to these lawmakers, save his political future? Instead, that they've heard from his team, they've heard from the campaign team, the White House, and not the president himself, besides some calls, here and there to Democratic leadership or certain caucuses. So I think people, are still saying that this isn't enough outreach. They haven't seen enough to feel 100% confident at this point.
And over on the House side, Nancy Pelosi, an influential voice in the Democratic Party, caused a stir yesterday by suggesting Biden being the nominee is not a settled matter. What has been the impact of that?
Yeah, that was huge. Nancy Pelosi's former Speaker of the House, but is a really influential Democrat. She knows how to win elections. She knows how to, flip the House when she needs to. And so this is a really important voice. And the fact that she kind of alluded to that this isn't a done deal, makes you question that if she knows, that other Democrats might be coming forward, if she knows that there's been questions behind the scenes. A lot of the general input that I've been hearing is that this decision, if Biden were to actually step aside, is going to be done in a closed door private setting. People have a lot of respect for the president. The Democratic Party is very thankful for his service and what he's been able to accomplish in his first term as president. So they want to be respectful of the situation and handle this behind closed doors. So Pelosi might be alluding to some private conversations that are coming up, or she's just trying to maybe make some other lawmakers feel comfortable, not just falling in line, and feel comfortable airing some concerns if they need to.
In a New York Times op-ed, actor George Clooney called on President Biden to end his campaign. Alex, Clooney is a major financial backer for the Democratic Party who just last month hosted a fundraiser with Biden in California.
That's right. So George Clooney had this front row seat to Biden last month in California. As you mentioned, this was a huge star-studded event, brought millions, tens of millions of dollars for the Biden campaign. But he was able to really spend time with Biden in a way that, us reporters don't really ever get to. And he came out and said that, maybe it's time for him to step aside. And that's huge because again, he, as you mentioned, is a huge backer of Democrats. This is a lot of financial support. But it comes as a time that I think people are starting to think, if I don't speak out now, so much is on the line. And folks like Clooney, longtime Democrats, know that former President Trump winning is something that they wouldn't be happy about. So they're feeling compelled to say something. But that's definitely a huge dagger to the Biden team, just because this is somebody that has been so supportive of the president.
And also lends credence to the notion that the debate performance wasn't a one-time event. But former President Trump joining in on this scrum with some harsh words for Clooney and Biden on social media. What's Trump saying?
Yeah, we heard from Trump, a go back to acting, both of you are a mess kind of thing, a typical Trump response. We saw the same when actor Robert De Niro came out outside Trump's courtroom when he was having his hush money trial in New York City and come out in this really staunch opposition to Trump. And Trump also snapped at him and said, go back to acting. Nobody watches your movies or whatever. There was something to that extent for Clooney as well. So I think Trump isn't thrilled when any actor comes into the mix here. But it is interesting that he wants to comment on this situation, considering it looks really bad for his opponent, Joe Biden. Any kind of public detractor like this, George Clooney is such a public figure. And as you mentioned, him saying that Biden needs to step aside really points to the fact that this debate was not a one-time thing, and that sometimes he doesn't come across as fit for another term in private settings as well, like a big campaign event. So it's interesting that Trump decided to comment on this one, whereas other times in the past 2 weeks, we've seen Trump kind of keep quiet because he knows that this mess that's going on in the Democratic Party is pretty good for him.
Yeah, and Clooney is not the only Democratic financial backer with concerns about Biden's candidacy. ABC News is reporting donations to the Biden campaign could fall by half during the month of July. Biden's been saying he doesn't really care about what the donors say about all this, but that seems like it would be another huge blow to the Biden campaign.
That's right. I think the donor space is a really critical one to watch right now because, if they start just backing out and saying, we're not interested in giving money if Biden's at the top of the ticket, that's a huge blow. As you mentioned, the Trump team has done really well raising money in the past couple of months. And the Biden team has some catching up to do in terms of the month-to-month figures. They do have a very robust war chest, which is essential. And, they're running ads left and right. They're traveling. Surrogates are traveling. They're spending money. But they still need the money flowing in. And donors have really been privately to reporters, on background, the most outspoken in terms of saying we're not seeing enough from the Biden campaign in terms of what the path is forward. They're really just saying, I hear your concerns. It was a bad night on the debate stage, but they're not airing what the plan is. And that's what I'm hearing from donors at this point. And I think if they start, dropping and saying we're not interested in giving more money, that's going to be huge for the president and really going to make him rethink his future.
And it's really not just donors. A new poll from ABC News found nearly 70% of voters think President Biden should end his reelection campaign, including a majority of Democrats. But that poll also shows Biden and Trump neck and neck in the race. So what do you make of that poll?
It's interesting. The Biden campaign came out with an internal memo today that they distributed to members of their campaign team. I got my hands on it, and it basically pointed to just that last bit of the ABC poll, that Biden and Trump are still tied, and said, things aren't really moving since the debate. But I think the bigger point about that poll is what you mentioned, that voters think that it's time for him to step aside. And, the president, as he's been traveling, we saw him at a campaign event in North Carolina and Wisconsin. You do hear these crowds around him, very supportive, chanting for him. But, that then has led the president to say, look, the voters love me. They still want me on the ticket, and the voters are the most important people. Well, yes, the voters at his rallies, will rally around him. But the big question is, if polling starts to show that voters want another candidate, they want another choice here, then he's going to have to listen to that polling, because as he knows, it really does come down to voters in November.
As Biden works to regain the confidence of skeptical Democrats and voters, he will sit down with NBC News' Lester Holt on Monday. Is this part of the Biden campaign's effort to get him out there more in these unscripted events?
Yeah, so this will be the third unscripted event. See, we saw him do an ABC interview with George Stephanopoulos. We're seeing tonight he's doing a press conference with reporters after the NATO summit, and then this NBC interview with Lester Holt. So they're really listening to critics who say we need to see more unscripted events in order to think that this debate performance was just a one-off. Because right now, if we're not seeing Biden out there, not with a teleprompter, how do we believe what you're telling us, that this isn't Biden, that he was just having a bad night? So these are really high-stake moments, just like the press conference tonight. He needs to show America that, he's ready for the challenge. He can answer a question on the spot. He can, verbalize his priorities when it comes to things like abortion, for foreign policy, democracy, which he says is at stake this election, that he can really communicate to the voters what he means by all of that, because it's something that we did not see him communicate well on the debate stage. And all these moments, tonight's press conference, the NBC interview with Lester Holt, will be really scrutinized, I think, by lawmakers. And if he stumbles during those moments, I think we'll see more lawmakers want to publicly come out and call for him to step aside.
Ukraine is on an irreversible path to NATO membership. That, according to a joint communique issued by member countries during the 75th anniversary NATO summit in Washington. There are many conditions that have to be met before Ukraine can actually officially be welcomed into the alliance. Why is NATO taking this action now? And some are actually saying this is an effort to sort of Trump-proof NATO.
That's right. So, it's been a matter of several months now that the Biden administration has told Ukraine, like, you're on the way here, but don't expect a formal invitation to join the alliance, soon. There's still hurdles, as you mentioned, that they have to get through. So we're not expecting any sort of formal invitation at the summit this week. And the Biden administration, I think, has been clear with Ukraine on that, but that, they want to see a path forward to Ukraine joining NATO. That would be a huge legacy item for Biden. He's been really adamant that him uniting NATO and him being the leader of supporting Ukraine puts him and puts the U.S. on this, global leadership platform. And he, I think, if he can be the president that essentially and eventually brings Ukraine into NATO, that would be something that's huge for his legacy. So I think we'll see it eventually. There are still some hurdles, but as you mentioned, these are efforts for the alliance to so-called, Trump-proof their support for Ukraine, so that these steps to move forward with Ukraine that the U.S. has been leading, joining NATO, that's, things like coordinating weapons donations that we've seen, having countries just, outright say that they're supporting Ukraine over Russia. Those are all things that will eventually perhaps lead to Ukraine joining NATO, and that can help in a Trump administration to force these allies, force the U.S. To keep up their support for NATO for Ukraine, if they're part of the alliance.
The U.S. House has passed a bill that would make it illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections. The Republican-sponsored bill received a handful of votes from Democrats, but the bill is likely to be ignored by Democrats who control the Senate. What are both sides saying about this bill?
Yeah, so I think as you mentioned, it's going to be, we'll see it ignored from Democrats in the Senate. We've also seen President Biden say that he's going to veto the measure. So it's not going to get very further than this. But opponents of the bill have been saying that basically the core idea of it, which is establishing non-citizen voting as illegal, is basically redundant. They argue that the provisions of the bill will more likely lead to U.S. citizens being denied their right to vote than preventing votes by foreign nationals. So They're concerned, these opponents are saying we need more U.S. citizens to be voting and we don't want their rights denied. Meanwhile, Speaker Mike Johnson, who's an opponent of the bill, a proponent of the bill, argued that the legislation is really necessary at this point because we're seeing non-citizens voting in U.S. elections, that this is happening, even though, it's illegal. So he's been pushing for this. I think this is a Republican talking point that they want to use on the debate stage, on the campaign trail, to show that Republicans are really strong on immigration. They want to make this a point that they can resonate with Americans on, that we don't want immigrants taking things from other Americans, like the right to vote. But at the same time, the opponents of this bill are obviously strong, and we're not going to see it move very far. And then they can use this on the campaign trail as well to try to appeal to Americans that are pro immigration and they want to see migrants getting more rights.
All right, that's all I got. Alex Gangitano, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
A new nationwide poll shows former President Trump with a 3-point lead over President Biden in the 2024 race. The poll came in at 46% for Trump, 43% for Biden. It's the first post-debate poll from Emerson College, and it shows Biden losing 2 percentage points since that time. Joining me now from Emerson College is Matt Taglia. Matt, it seems like this is consistent with other polling. Trump didn't necessarily get a boost from the debate, but Biden is seeing a small but consistent loss.
Absolutely. So the top line for Biden decreased by about 2 points. So we see some small changes among subgroups. We now see Trump winning independents overall. But, as noted, Trump seems to have hit a wall of roughly 46 to 47% before we ask undecideds to make a decision between the two candidates. And we do have a slightly higher number of undecided voters in this latest poll. So I think we're seeing muted effects of the debate. That 2-point decline for Biden could translate to larger losses at the state level. And overall, I think that this is the best that the Biden campaign could hope for, given the debate performance and the subsequent media, party fallout, all of that.
Yeah, and it seems like if you're advocating for Biden to remain in the race, there is some good news in this poll. While he is losing to Trump, other Democrats whose names have been floated as possible replacements are actually doing worse. That includes Vice President Harris.
Yes. So Vice President Harris actually performs best among all of the hypothetical Democrats that we tested in the poll. But she still loses to Trump by about 6 points in the head-to-head. Again, that's as close as it gets. So Governor Newsom is down by about 8 points versus Trump. Governor Shapiro is down by about 8. And then Governor Whitmer is down by about 10. And that just gets worse as you start looking at some of the other candidates. So this is definitely some good news for the Biden campaign as far as an argument to remain in the race. But none of the candidates are benefiting from being a sitting president, having that media attention, having that ad campaign. So I do think that some of the support could be muted in this case for some of these candidates that folks might just not necessarily know or who haven't had the same stage time as President Biden has. So again, that could be a little artificially muted.
You talked about those undecided voters. Your latest polling shows 63% of undecided voters are leaning towards Biden, with 37% saying they would vote for Trump. Is that kind of some pent-up enthusiasm for Biden that might play out over the rest of the campaign if he, in fact, stays in the race?
I don't know about enthusiasm. It is a slight change from our June polling, where we had undecideds breaking for President Biden by 55% roughly versus 45% for former President Trump. And after the push, it's about 50% undecided splitting their vote. So, I think that it's good news for the Biden campaign. He's maintaining where he was with undecided voters prior to the debate in June. But, again, I think this is not even across geography. It could be worse for Biden in some of these swing states. And as we look at voter motivation, we can see that some of those traditional groups for President Biden are not as motivated as we would maybe expect.
The Biden campaign is focused on outreach to Black and Hispanic voters, hoping they can boost the president in states like Georgia, Nevada, and Arizona. The latest Emerson numbers indicate that only 53% of Black voters and only 49% of Hispanic voters say they are extremely motivated to vote in this election. How concerning are those numbers for the Biden campaign?
Yeah, these should be concerning numbers for the Biden campaign. With Black voters in particular, who form one of the most important constituencies for him, the 54% who are extremely motivated to vote. White voters, on the other hand, nearly 80% say that they're extremely motivated. The Biden campaign is going to be dependent upon some of these Black voters. They're also going to be dependent upon some of these younger folks. And as we've seen, voter enthusiasm decreases as you get younger. So these older folks are much more motivated to vote than these younger folks. And those younger folks, minority voters, these are the people who President Biden will be dependent on, and he's going to have to get motivated, turn them out, and in some cases, convince them to vote for him. He's doing worse with Black voters overall than he was in 2020, and same goes for younger voters. So it's a bit of a tough ask and a heavy lift for the Biden campaign there.
This year's NATO summit is wrapping up today here in Washington, D.C. The U.S. continues to press for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, while the war in Ukraine is continuing with really no end in sight. How do voters view the Biden administration's policies on these conflicts, and could that have a major impact on the presidential election?
Well, it absolutely could have an impact. And though we didn't test these conflicts in particular in this poll, we've seen in some of our previous polling that overall, voters don't really approve of the Biden administration's handling of the war in Israel and Gaza. And we see in this poll that 55% say that foreign policy is worse now than it was 4 years ago under the Trump administration. Only 27% say it's better. And that includes about 25% of Democrats and about 25% of Biden voters who supported the president in 2020. These are not numbers that I want to see if I'm the Biden campaign. It might not be a major issue to most folks, but it's something that's in the background, and it's something that does weigh on their mind at the ballot box. So there will be some pressure tonight on the speech to wrap up the NATO summit in something that's positive for the Biden campaign. So we'll be watching that and how he tries to have a better turn on his foreign policy going forward.
All right. Thank you, Matt Taglia. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
One-time Trump fixer Michael Cohen is asking the Supreme Court to let him sue former President Trump. The appeal is the latest in an ongoing battle between Trump and Cohen, who was the star witness in the former president's May hush money trial. Cohen is now asking the high court to hear his claim that Trump and other government officials had Cohen thrown back in prison because he was threatening to write a book painting Trump in a negative light. In 2018, Cohen pleaded guilty to federal campaign finance crimes. He was serving a 3-year sentence before being released for health reasons in 2020. But the Trump administration forced Cohen back to prison after Cohen announced plans to write the book. In the end, a federal judge ordered Cohen's release a second time in a rebuke to the Trump administration. In an interview with The Hill, Cohen said his experience was a practice run for the sweeping retribution Trump is promising if elected to a second term in November. Cohen's request is seen as a long shot, as the high court has repeatedly declined to take similar cases. The House rejected a resolution Thursday to hold Attorney General Merrick Garland in inherent contempt of Congress. The resolution would have fined Garland $10,000 each day he did not turn over audio tapes from President Biden's interview with the special counsel investigating his handling of classified documents. GOP Representative Anna Paulina Luna spearheaded the effort, forcing a vote on the matter despite some GOP opposition. The audio tapes have taken on new significance since the presidential debate. In a report detailing why he would not be seeking to charge Biden, the special counsel said any jury would likely see Biden as an elderly man with poor memory. Republicans have argued for public release of the recordings. The Biden administration has exerted executive privilege, claiming their release could hurt future law enforcement investigations. Inflation fell 0.1% in June. New numbers from the Consumer Price Index show the cost for goods and services dropped from May. Overall inflation hovering around 3%, the lowest level in more than 3 years. The S&P 500 and NASDAQ hit record highs after the softer than expected inflation numbers increased hopes for the Federal Reserve to cut rates. The 0.1 percentage drop in June marks the third month in a row for declining annual increases in the Consumer Price Index. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hills YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.